All right, we're here live with 52 weeks of AWS, and it's amazing how many episodes I've actually done here. And this week is an exciting one because we're going to cover a new certification. We're going to cover the AWS Developer Certification. One thing that I will say is that there is a ton of material available on the O'Reilly platform that you can access. And let me just share it with you right here. So there's a series on O'Reilly called 52 Weeks of AWS, the complete series, and there's already about 17 hours of material, believe it or not, because I cover things like how to use the Cloud Shell, how to use PowerShell with Cloud Shell, how to use, .NET and GitHub code spaces for AWS, you know, uh, getting started with AWS, all the solutions. So if you want to go deep into all of AWS here, this is the way to go. Next, though, let's get into the AWS Developer Certification, Module 2, Introduction to Developing on AWS. And to get started here, let's talk about the systems development lifecycle. And so the systems development lifecycle is the challenge of software delivery. And really, in an enterprise in particular, there's the stability that you want because the company is making money. And then you also have the need to make features, right? And so there's a conflict there. And you also want to deliver software with zero tolerance for outages. And you want to have quick, secure, reliable ways of doing things. So what is the systems development lifecycle here? We have plan, we have define, we have design, and then we have develop. And then in the develop phase, this is where you would build a new system, right? Like you're architecting out maybe a serverless application or step functions, or maybe like a machine learning application. What are some of the components? Some of the components would be the new components and programs installed, the users trained, performance tested, adjustments made, right? These are all the main components. Some of the methodologies, I think there's more than this, but in general, one way to think about the software development lifecycle methodologies is a waterfall, which is a traditional, and you do a plan, define, design, develop, deploy, and maintain. And this has a lot of benefits. But in terms of the weaknesses is that it's fairly rigid. Agile is a newer way of developing things. And the idea is you plan something, define it, design it, develop it, deploy it, maintain it, and you're iterating through over and over again. And you're trying to improve constantly the quality of your software project. That's really the main difference. Now, in terms of the phases of software development, we have the code, right? Checking your code, plus do some peer review on it, potentially build it. So compile your code, do unit tests, style checks, code metrics, maybe create an image and a container. And then in the test phase, you would go through and do additional checks like integration tests, load testing, user testing. I like to do load testing myself programmatically every time I push to a certain environment, penetration, so security testing. Finally, when you're ready to deploy, the code can use different strategies to minimize downtime, like red, blue, gates, things like that. And after the code is deployed, you have to monitor it. So this is where people do things like look at dashboards and other such features. All right, let's talk about getting started to do developing on AWS. So how do you get started developing on AWS? Well, first step would be an account. So get an AWS account. Free tier is available. Set up your permissions. Make sure that you're using the IAM role that is suited to the jobs you do, not using the root user. Also, you want to install a development environment. So in the case of Python, you'd use Boto 3, and then use the CLI as well. So, there's Java, Python, .NET. I've used all of those, and they're all great SDKs. Now, getting started, one of the things to remember when you first set up an account is that you need to identify the root user, make sure you keep that locked away, and then you use an admin user or some other subset user so that you're not making your account vulnerable. In terms of identity, this is authentication. So this means who can access your AWS resources. Access management is what resources can they use and in what ways. A good example of IAM would be like a user, let's say John Doe has AWS credentials, and they would be inside of a group. The group could be the developer group, and the developers could maybe have read-write changes to DynamoDB, also to a relational database, and like RDS, and then also S3. Those would be a good example. The role is a trusted entity with developer permissions, and a policy would be associated with the developer policy, and they would have access to specific services and operations. Now, in terms of getting started, there are a lot of toolkits actually. One of my personal favorites is AWS Cloud9 because you're in a cloud-based development environment. You can also use things like Eclipse, IntelliJ, PyCharm, Visual Studio Code, Azure DevOps, Writer. There's a ton of different environments that you can use that have really deep integration. So Cloud9, I would say, is definitely one of the huge wins here, and it's an IDE that lets you have access to a Linux server that runs your code. A few things you can start really quickly with Cloud9, and it's definitely a huge win. And also, you can code together with Cloud9 in real time. In fact, I've got a Cloud9 just happened to be open right here, and with Cloud9, a couple things to be aware of is that if I typed in, for example, AWS, S3, LS, right, it already has access to everything in terms of the CLI. I was just having to work on some C# code here, and the C# code is allowing me to programmatically create a bucket through the CDK stack. Very minimal things I need to do to my environment to get the infrastructure as code working because, again, it's inside of an environment that AWS manages. So there's a lot of advantages to using the Cloud9 development environments. And also serverless is really easy with Cloud9. In fact, if you go to the AWS tab, you can go to the Explorer and you can look at all the different features that you can do inside of here, including building Lambda functions, for example. And if I want to invoke that Lambda function directly inside of the environment of AWS and do commands to it, right? It's trivial to do that. So the development environment would be your computer plus Cloud9 is one way to do it. And in this particular example, you could actually connect to either EC2 or your own server. And that's actually kind of a neat way to work things. You can also use your own server as well with this. So you can actually use Cloud9 to create another environment that your machine is able to communicate with. And also you can work with code commit, which is its own version control system. So it's a fully managed source control system. So a lot like GitHub, but specifically for AWS. So with the editor, a few things that you can do with Cloud9, you can actually have live syntax checking, auto indent, auto completion, code folding, split panes, all kinds of stuff. And it's actually really fast, even for huge projects. And it has support for 40 different languages, which is pretty amazing, actually. And all the things are pre-installed. As I mentioned, again, Cloud9, I could just do AWS. In fact, I can just do help, right? If I say AWS help, and I can see all the different things that you can do, right, with AWS. It's just all pre-installed for me inside of that environment. If I want to open up a new editor or runtime here, I can just go to run, and I can take a look at those. But in general, Cloud9 is my favorite environment for AWS. Now, there's one other one as well, just to talk about, which is there's also Cloud Shell, which is a new one. And so Cloud Shell can do very similar things as well. and you can run AWS commands, etc. And it takes a few minutes to wake up. So how do you get started? Again, the CLI is one of the easiest ways to get started with it. And the Cloud Shell actually is a great place to play around with it. So you don't even have to use Cloud9 if you want to just use the cloud-based development environment. So in terms of interacting with the services, there's 4 different ways here. And so directly, right? So you can just call the API. That's an easy way to do it. You can be external to AWS and just talk to it that way. You can also use the management console, and the management console is this, right? This is the management console here, and you can search through different services. The command line interface, as I mentioned, Cloud Shell would be a perfect example. If I just want to go through and say AWS S3 LS, and I want to sync files and move them around. Many people don't know you can do all of that inside of here. You can invoke Lambda functions. I think if we say Lambda help, right, I can interact with it. It really is an amazing environment just from the command line. And again, Cloud Shell is a good place to do that. You also have the SDKs, so things like Boto 3. So if we go through and we look at Boto 3, right, and I go to Boto 3, you can see there's just a ton of services. If I want to talk to S3, there we go. It gives me all the docs and directly lets me talk to it. In fact, what's pretty cool is if I go to Cloud Shell here and I just type in IPython, I just say pip install IPython, something like that. Pip's not installed. Well, we could go to our other environments and we could say Python 3 -m venv this bit of virtual environments. You could source it, source /.venv, then activate, and then do a pip install IPython, and then install IPython. This is my favorite way to work with Boto 3, and then do a pip install Boto 3. What this will give us is that we can easily try out the documentation, right? Import Boto 3 client, right? And I could say, clients, whatever, do a tab, and it'll show me all the different things that I can do. So trivial, in fact, to play around with the Boto 3 API by just installing it on one of those environments, either Cloud Shell or Cloud9. So command line tools here, we've got the AWS CLI. We've also got the PowerShell. So this is another thing that people aren't aware of, is that if we go back to Cloud Shell, if I just type in PS or PowerShell, is it PShell? Is it? I thought it was PS. Let's see here. So PowerShell and Cloud Shell. What the command is, it is AWS PowerShell Cloud Shell is for the documentation PWSH. So you just go through here, PWSH, boom, we're in PowerShell, right? You can toggle back and forth depending on what it is you're doing. And I actually do stuff in PowerShell. I just, for some reason, didn't remember that. There's AWS SAM Local, which allows you to deploy Lambda applications, and there's Amplify. So the general context here for the tools would be the name of the tool, like AWS, the command, the service command, like EC2, and then the subcommand, which is the operation, and then the parameters. So all command line tools have this unified interface here, which is actually very, very awesome, and a great tool to actually have available because of the unified interface. The Amazon resource name, or ARNs, here you can see that there is a way of defining them where there's ARN, AWS, DynamoDB, US West 2, the name of the account, and then the resource, right? So there's a unified naming structure for resources as well. So let's talk a little bit about developing with the AWS software development kits, right? SDKs, Java, .NET, Node, Python, Ruby, JavaScript, Go, C Sharp, tons of different kits here. When you develop, you can use the SDKs to make the calls for the services, and then you can write an application using the SDK in your language of choice. So this is a way of providing one or more APIs for a service, and the constructs request work for the service API, and they process the response and propagate it back to an application. And so in this particular example, let's talk about using Python. There would be one method per service operation and the objects for the request and result. So in Python, if I wanted to list the objects in a bucket, I could write a function called list client, make an instance of the client, S3 client, boto3.client, for example, and then I could go through and just programmatically list the objects in a particular bucket and then print them out. And so we could do this ourselves pretty easily. If I let's try that. Let's do Python 3-mv. Let's see if that works. A Python virtual environment and Cloud Shell, and then I source it, and then I just do pip install boto3, right? And then once I've got boto3, I can do whatever I want. I can actually play around with some cool stuff. Like I could do, again, boto3 resource S3, right? So I can say import boto3, make a client of it, and then go in and do something similar to making a bucket or listing a bucket, etc. Right. So very, very straightforward to build out a service using SDK with a resource API. The other thing you can do is specify regions. So the AWS cloud infrastructure has regions and availability zones. So region is a geographic place. Availability zone is a physically isolated location. And with some of the SDKs, you can actually specify the region when you're using a service. And you can do that in the AWS config file, like in tilde.aws config. That would be a good place to take that out. So let's talk about errors and exceptions here. So when you're handling an error, a 400 would be error in application, 500 is server error. And so the error will contain a few different things, like container for all the error elements. The code is the string that uniquely identifies an error condition. The message is a generic description of the error. A resource is a resource that's involved in the error. The request ID is the ID of the request associated with the error. And so that's really the uniformed way that you can think about dealing with errors when you're programming. Now, in terms of exceptions as well, there's actually specific exception runtimes or exception libraries that you can use. And with Java, it would be Amazon Service Exception and subclasses, and that will handle it. With the boto3, they have botocore.exceptions.client error, and JavaScript has async callbacks. Now let's talk about X-Ray, which is a pretty cool service. What it does is it allows you to have additional insights into your application. And so X-Ray is an application performance management tool. So you can look at it to identify bugs, look at errors, things like that. And so you can create a service map and track requests to your application. You can identify errors and bugs automatically. You can identify performance bottlenecks. So X-Ray can help you identify these. And then you can build your own analysis and visualization application. So it's really a tool that allows you to have deep introspection of the runtime itself of the application. So how does it work? Well, X-Ray will collect the data about the request to your application. It provides tools to view, filter, and gain insights. And also, go through and then analyze those issues. Now, here's a good example of how it would work is it has a service map that maybe looks at Lambda, and then Lambda itself talks to other parts of the ecosystem, like it talks to another Lambda, which then talks to different tables. It will measure the latency of each single request. And what's really helpful about this is in a serverless type ecosystem, it's almost impossible to know everything that's happening without one of these kinds of tools. Now let's talk about CloudWatch and CloudTrail, which are two monitoring tools. CloudWatch itself is really like the one-stop shop for metrics, logs, things like that. You can set alarms, you can react to changes. Really, it's the place that you would set up the monitoring for your infrastructure. And in general, you can monitor things like CPU, memory, disk I/O, networking, all things you need to know if your application is working properly. You can react to application log events. You can automatically scale EC2 instance fleet, and you can view status as well. So here's a good example of a basic metrics repository, and with it you can create either custom metrics or use metrics. You can see that in the case of Elastic Load Balancer, that as things are scaling up and down, that those metrics are being captured by CloudWatch, which then can say, oh, look, I'm exceeding the threshold for the scale group. And so once I exceed 75%, let's go ahead and spin up a new instance, right, or 60%. And Amazon CloudWatch is actually the mechanism that allows us to do auto scaling. So it's really a deep integration between those services. Now, kind of a very different tool, even though the names sound the same, is AWS CloudTrail. And it's used for governance, compliance, operational auditing, and also risk auditing as well. And so for security, really it's a must-have because it shows you every single API call that your system is making. And so the result is that you can know when actually certain events are happening. And the CloudTrail integrates with holistically every single part of AWS. So it integrates with the cloud services like EC2, VPC, these kinds of things. It also integrates with the SDK, so you know what's happening, and also the CLI. So what happens is it'll tell you who made the request and actually what it is that they're doing, what was requested, when and from where, and then what was actually the response. So this is invaluable, right? If you're doing auditing, and any modern company has to have constant auditing of their system. And you can look at the AWS CloudTrail event history as well. And so you can actually use this to modify and delete activities for services. You can download the last 90 days and do some kind of machine learning analysis or whatever it is you're going to do with it. So really it's a must-have with a comprehensive event history. And it's really good for troubleshooting as well, because you can go in, if you're trying to make a call via Boto 3 or something, you could see, oh, look, the permission's denied, right? That's why I'm getting a bug where maybe you didn't know that without that additional level of detail. So there's even uses outside of just security. So in general, I would say maybe the takeaway here is that if you haven't used Cloud9, I would definitely kick the tires on Cloud9. It's something I use constantly for AWS. And in a nutshell, the Cloud9 environment is a huge win for people that are big fans of AWS, like I am. All right, so that's it for today. And if I dive into next week, what I'm going to cover is IAM next week. So we covered getting started, and then we're going to do a deep dive on the permission system and role system for AWS. All right, I'll see you next week.